This week we are focusing on chapter 4 in the textbook, which has to do with the goods market, saving, investment, and the determination of the equilibrium real interest rate in the economy. In the previous chapter, in chapter 3, we talked about the production function and the labor market. These are two pieces of our overall macroeconomic model. And we're going to be adding one more piece, and that has to do with the money market and asset market and how the Federal Reserve carries out monetary policy. So we'll be talking about that, and we'll be able to put that all together to talk about a unified, comprehensive model. That we'll wait a little while with that last piece because we're still talking about the long run. We're still talking, and all we really need is saving and investment, the goods market, and the labor market, and the production function for talking about long-run economic growth and the economy in the long run. So, in this chapter, let me take a step back. In the previous chapter, in chapter number 3, we derived the labor demand curve from profit maximizing behavior by firms, right? Demanding labor to maximize profits in terms of production. Labor supply was derived from utility maximizing decisions by individuals, consumers, suppliers of labor, talking about how much leisure that they want to consume. Really, it's a choice about leisure. Leisure is a good, and so the choice, the demand for leisure, right, determines the supply of labor because it's what's left in the day, right, after making decisions about how much leisure to consume. So that was a discussion in that chapter. Labor demand and labor supply together in the labor market determine the real wage in equilibrium and the level of employment. Once we understand the level of employment, we can just find that on the production function, because the production function has employment on the horizontal axis, output, real GDP, on the vertical axis. And when we look and find the level of employment from the labor market, that will tell us how much output can be produced at full employment. So full employment output means the output level that the equilibrium level of employment in the labor market can produce with a given amount of capital and a given amount of technology. If those things change, it's going to change the production function, and it's going to change the labor market, as well as changes in labor supply. Those don't shift the production function. That's a move along the production function. Labor supply shifts. So we're going to use the same kind of reasoning in chapter 4 to talk about the goods market. There are two curves. We're going to find where those curves cross. That's the equilibrium. And where those two curves cross is going to determine a quantity of saving, the quantity of investment, and a price. In this case, it's the price of saving, the price of investment related to investment. It's the real interest rate. So once we're done with chapter 4, we've got saving, we have investment, we have the real interest rate, we have employment, we have the real wage, and we have real GDP. Those are all indicators, macroeconomic indicators in the economy, in the U.S. economy. Those are things that we pay attention to. The Wall Street Journal pays attention to. Economists pay attention to, because they give us some clues about what's going on in the economy. And what we're doing is we're developing a model based on theory. It's a graphical model in this case that helps us explain and understand what's going on in the real world. It helps us predict, helps us evaluate, helps us to answer questions. What if this changed? Then what would happen to this? That's the name of the game the whole semester for us in this course. We're going to do that over and over and over again. We're going to ask different questions depending on what market we're looking at, depending on the policies that we're looking at. We can think about fiscal policy, monetary policy, and we can talk about economic growth, and we can use this model that we're building piece by piece. We're just building another piece in this chapter, chapter 4. We're going to put that all together in chapters to come. By the time we get to chapter 9, we will have all the pieces together in one single model, one single graph, right? And we'll be able to think about the entire economy, including other variables that we haven't looked at yet, like the price level, for example. We need another market, the market for money, assets, in order to bring that into the model. We'll be doing that once we get to chapter 8, course, or 7 or 8. So chapter 4, let's take a quick guided tour through that. Let me share the screen. Textbook. So what you see in the textbook, right, is in the table of contents for chapter 4. There are 3 sections in this chapter. You can look at the appendix. It's not required, but it brings it together algebraically. If that's something that you find helpful, you can do that. But it's an algebraic representation, really, of along with some additional microeconomic theory, explaining what's going on in these other sections. So there's an overall introduction in the chapter. Then we're going to talk about consumption and saving. They're just 2 sides of the same coin, just like demand for leisure is the other side of the coin of supply of labor. Consumption for a given amount of income, consumption is what's left after you make a decision about saving, or saving is what's left after you make a decision about consumption, right? So either way, you can think about it that way for a given amount of income. Whereas in chapter 3, it was how much time do we have for supplying labor, and we figure that out after we figure out how much leisure we want to consume, because there are 24 hours in the day. We just divide up the rest. The next section is about investment. Investment is by firms, right? When we talk about saving, right, back from that uses of saving identity, we have private saving and government saving, right? So government saving, we're just going to take as a given, as a budget deficit, and it's not related to some other economic theory. That's a decision made by the president and Congress, right? Whereas consumption, that part, private saving, in other words, is made by individuals. And again, we're going to use utility maximization kind of framework for that. For investment, that's by firms. It's the other side of the market, right? And that is a profit maximizing decision about how much capital firms want to purchase, right? How much capital, the act of buying capital is we call investment. That's what investment means in macroeconomics. Not buying stocks and bonds, it's buying plant and equipment and software, computers, etc. Right? We put those 2 together to get goods market equilibrium. Right? That's section 4.3. And what we see is that determines the equilibrium interest rate and the amount of saving and investment in the economy overall. And then we ask questions about, well, what happens if there's something that causes saving to change? What happens if there's something that causes investment to change? What's the impact overall on the economy? Right? So that's what those learning objectives are here that are laid out in the very beginning of this chapter. So a little bit of review from the previous chapters, right? So it's important that we always kind of take a look back where we've been and then where we're going in the next chapter. What we're going to assume here that we're going to bring back in chapter 5 is that we don't have any net exports. There are no other countries. So we have what we call a closed economy. That's going to be our assumption in this chapter, just to keep things simple to begin with. And we're going to add that back in the next chapter. So the first section, right, has to do with what's happening, what determines the level of consumption and saving. We're going to focus on saving. Consumption is just the other side of that. You can see that this opens up, and there are subsections within each one of these sections, right? And so we want to say, what happens when income changes? What happens when these are all the factors that affect saving and consumption decisions, along with fiscal policy effect of the government. That's the government saving part. The other parts here have to do with private saving, right? Saving by the public, saving, private saving, right? So that's all. That's what's going on in this particular section. We're going to use things that we saw back from chapter 2, right? How we define what saving is, and then what's the decision that's going on here in terms of individual decision making, right? So they're trying to maximize utility given a certain amount of income, making decisions about how much to spend today, current consumption, and future consumption. Right, so we think about it sort of a two-period model, today and the future, right? It's just it's a simplified model, and what we're doing is say, well, what people want to do is they kind of want to smooth consumption over time. They don't want to just consume necessarily when their income's high, not consume it at all when their income's really low. Sometimes you can borrow, all right, if you are your income is low. That's how people buy houses and cars, right? Otherwise, you'd have to wait until your income was higher. So the question is, right, a decision about how much to spend today on consumption and how much to spend in the future. That's the decision that is going to lead us to the things that affect the amount of saving and consumption in the economy. Okay. So the interest rate, real interest rate comes into play here because there's a trade-off between present consumption and future consumption, right? So the more future consumption you want, the more you need to save today. Why do you save? Because you're going to get interest on that money, and that's going to give you more money in the future. You can have more goods and services in the future if you are prudent. Prudence here, right? If you're prudent with your money today. And so the real interest rate tells us what the value of that trade-off is. What's it going to cost you, right, in terms of consumption tomorrow if you consume more today? It's the interest that you could have gotten had you saved that money. Okay? So that's what happens, and we go through and then ask the question with that kind of framework. Well, what happens if current income changes? Well, you know, that's going to make some decision. That's going to have some impact on how much we consume today, and perhaps how much we consume tomorrow. So the notion of the marginal propensity to consume comes into play. You may have heard about that in your Principles of Macroeconomics course, Econ 201. So if you get additional income, you spend more. You spend more today, right? So you spend part of that. That's what the marginal propensity to consume tells us, right? But not all of it, right? So you also increase saving because you save some of it, unless your marginal propensity to consume is 100%, right? So you're going to be able to have more in the future as well as more present consumption and future consumption can increase, right? But also saving is going to increase. So if income goes up, saving is going to increase. What about expected future income? Well, your current income hasn't changed, but probably have an impact on your spending today if you expect future income to go up. This happens when people get a job offer when they graduate, right, from college. Maybe they go out and buy a car, new car, or a newer car, because they know they're going to be able to make those monthly payments, you know, a month or two from now, because they're going to make a lot more money in that new job that they're getting. So current consumption may increase, but your income today hasn't increased yet, right? And so saving actually goes down, all right? So that's another thing that you need to be thinking about, right? Now, what's the effect of changes in wealth? Well, one of the ways you can think about wealth, right? Winning the lottery. I'm going to take an extreme version of that. You get an inheritance, whatever. So you're probably going to increase your consumption today, right? If that happens, but your income hasn't changed, right? So it would actually cause, you're going to increase a higher fraction of your current income, leaving less to save. You have this big change in wealth, you have that to draw on, but your actual current saving would go down in that case. And then what about the change in the real interest rate? Well, here, just like in the decision by workers in chapter 3, when they're making decisions about if there's a change in the real wage, right? They're making decisions about whether to get more leisure, right? Work less or work more, right? That's going to depend on the real wage. And as we said in that chapter, there's an income and a substitution effect. The same thing is true here. I'll say there's an increase in the real interest rate. That means that you have a bigger reward for saving today. So that should increase your saving today, right? But at the same time, or penalizes not saving, consuming today, right? Because you're missing out on the higher interest that you could get. At the same time, with a higher real interest rate, to get to a certain amount of future consumption, you don't need to save as much because the interest rate is higher. So there's an income and a substitution effect. So it's theoretically, we can't say for sure which one is going to dominate. But generally, we can talk about the effect of the real interest rate on the amount of saving, which one tends to dominate. So then we have fiscal policy. This has to do with government saving. The other parts before this had to do with private saving. But remember, national saving is government saving plus private saving, right? And this depends on fiscal policy, the policy making by Congress and by the president. So that we're going to treat that as a decision that's made outside the model. It's not affected by necessarily by those other elements that we've been talking about. All right? But it is possible, all right, as it says here, general or fiscal policy can affect desired consumption today, right? Depends what you think is going to happen to taxes in the future, right? Because of a bigger budget deficit today. For example, if you thought that bigger budget deficits today mean higher taxes in the future, maybe you save more today to pay those higher taxes in the future. So in that case, then the question is, do you save enough to offset the lower saving by the government, right? So that's what this chapter, or this section in the chapter is getting at overall. Okay? That's the question of when the government saves $1 less, does private saving go up by the same amount? If you remember that uses of saving identity from the homework number 1, right? That the last question in that homework dealt with exactly this question, right? So if private saving goes up to offset the decreased government saving, then there may not be any impact on the economy of an increase in government spending. But if that's not the case, then there will be some offsetting impact on the economy. And that's partly what this section of the chapter is talking about. Right? So that's saving, and we can get a saving curve ultimately that we can talk about what the relationship between, there's a whole information here, this idea of Ricardian equivalence, right? I want to point out here, these summary tables are actually really important in each chapter. So pay attention. These are the things that shift curves. And everything that we're about in this course is about shifting curves and then what happens. So the general process is there's something that happens in the economy. You ask the question, which curve which market, which curve, which way. And then we work through what are the overall impacts in those markets from those curves shifting. And that's how we use our model to then say something about what's going to happen to GDP, what's going to happen to employment, what's going to happen to the real interest rate, real wage, etc. Right. So the next section has to do with investment. This is again decisions by firms on how much capital that they want to put in place, and they've got a simple example in this section to make that clear. Right, but it's important to understand that investment has to do with how much capital, desired capital stock that firms want to have, and what are the things that affect that decision. The higher the desired capital stock, the more investment there needs to be in new capital, right? So those are things that would increase investment in the economy. Okay? So again, just like talking about firms demanding labor, in this case, it's firms demanding capital. Right, that's the other part of the production function: labor, capital, and technology, or A, total factor productivity, in the production function. So this is a question about what affects the capital stock, but it's the same idea conceptually as demanding labor. In this case, they're demanding capital. So in the case of demanding labor, what did that depend on? The real wage, right, and the marginal product of labor, right? The marginal cost of hiring another worker, the real marginal is the real wage. The marginal benefit they get from hiring another worker is the marginal productivity of labor. Well, more capital, another piece of capital, a bigger oven, another industrial robot in a factory. What do you get from that? You get additional output. The marginal productivity of capital, the MPK, is the extra capital you get from hiring one more unit, buying one more unit of capital. So what do we have to compare that to in terms of whether to do that or not? The user cost of capital, right? So it's the additional cost of getting that piece of capital in its use. Okay, and so there's a simple example in this section to talk about that. And what are the things that matter? The actual price of the capital, the rate at which it depreciates, and then the expected real interest rate. Because the assumption is that you've got to borrow money to get that new piece of capital, so you're going to have to pay interest, right, on that borrowed money. And even if you just use cash that you've saved up as a company, right, using that cash means you're missing out on the interest you could have gotten by having that cash in the bank earning interest. Okay, so the user cost of capital is the expected real cost of using a unit of capital for a specified period of time. Okay, so it has to do, it's not just the buying the capital, it's how its use, right? It's going to depreciate over time, so part of it gets used up each year, right? And so you can depreciate that over time. What you care about is not the absolute cost of that piece of machinery, that oven, that industrial robot, but rather how much it costs to use it each year, right? How much it costs to be able to get this in terms of a year, okay? So, and then how much extra output can you get from using that capital over that period of time, right? It's the same exact idea as with labor, right? Except there, people were talking about wages, hourly wages. So how much extra output do you get an hour? What's the cost of using that labor? It's the real wage you have to pay. It's exactly the same process. So the things that are going to affect a firm's decision about how much capital to purchase has to do with how productive the capital is, right? As well as how much the capital costs, how fast it depreciates, and the real interest rate, right? So those are things that are going to affect how much capital. There's the marginal product of capital. There's the user cost of capital, right? And they keep buying more capital up to the point which the marginal benefit, the marginal product of capital, is just equal to how much it costs to use that capital for a year, right? So that's the desired capital stock. And if there's a change in one of these, something that shifts one of these curves, it's going to change where that intersection happens. And it's going to change, therefore, what the desired level of capital stock is. And it's either going to cause investment to increase or it's going to cause investment to decrease. So that's the game. That's the game we play. So I've already said kind of the process here. How do we go from desired capital stock to investment? Right? Anything that increases desired capital stock ultimately is going to increase the amount of investment. Partly because some of the machinery wears out. And you've got to replace that. If your desired capital stock is staying the same, so you've got to replace that to keep that constant. And then if you want to increase it even more, then it requires purchasing even more capital. Right. So this section is getting us to see the desired level of investment, the net amount of investment, and then which is just the difference between how much capital you have the next period and how much you have today. Right? These are subscripts, meaning today and one more period in the future, another year, another month, maybe another year. And those are the things that have, ultimately, that's how we talk about investment, right? Inventories in housing, and as well as inventories, as well as inventory in new, investment in new capital. Right? So we bring this all together to talk about goods market equilibrium. So this goes through the process, and where saving equals investment, that's where equilibrium is. We already know this essentially from that uses of saving identity. We have saving equals investment plus the current account. These are desired levels, so it's not just an identity anymore. Things can be out of equilibrium, right? So these are desired levels and not the necessarily always actual levels, right? And then we use a saving investment diagram, right? So what does the saving curve represent? As you change the level of the real interest rate, right? That was that substitution and income effect back in the first section in this chapter. The higher the real interest rate, the more saving there is. It's a move along the curve. Any of those other things that affects the desire, or sorry, that affects the decision about how much to save or how much to consume, right? Like current income, expected future income, wealth, any of those things are going to shift this curve, right? They're going to move this curve either left or right. That's an increase to the right, decrease to the left. Okay. Similarly, with investment, the higher the real interest rate, right, from the second section of this chapter, right, that increases the user cost, and so there's going to generally that the marginal cost is increasing then, and so they're going to tend to have less investment. Right, desired capital stock is less when the user cost of capital is high. Price of buying capital, price of using capital, not buying capital. Price of using capital is high. They're going to use less of it. Right, there's going to be less demand for new capital investment. Any of the other things, depreciation rate, the price of capital, or tax rates that affect the marginal productivity of capital, the tax on business profits, for example, right? What they get from investing in new capital is going to cause these curves to shift, this curve to shift. So we're looking at the equilibrium level of saving and investment. Those two have to be equal in equilibrium, and the equilibrium real interest rate. As there's a shift in any of these curves, it's going to change the values of those variables, right? So it's the same that, so here's again, another example with some actual numbers. What are the things that shift the saving curve? Remember, that's those summary tables in each chapter. It's important to understand why the things in those summary tables shift the curves the way they do, and then to be able to work through what's going to be the impact of that. So if there's something that causes a decline in desired saving, the question is, what would cause that? That's what you need to be thinking about. Homework examples will give you, we'll go do it the opposite way typically and say, what if something happens? Show me what's going to happen in the goods market, right? And it's going to either involve a shift to the right or the left of investment, or a shift to the right or left of saving, right? That's it. That's got to be one of those four things. It's like multiple choice at that point. So it's important to understand what causes shifts in those curves, right? Shift investment curve, what would cause that, right? And then there's some examples of that. So this is connecting to the real world and the kinds of things that I will ask you as well, right? To connect to. I'll give you an example, real world example. And that's really it for this chapter, right? Then there's summary at the end of the chapter, as there is in every chapter. What the key diagram is, key terms, etc. And so I encourage you to go to look through that. And then to go back to the beginning of the chapter, say, hey, do I understand what these learning outcomes are? And can I think of something in the real world that would shift one of these curves? And then what would be the impact of that? That's the sort of thing that we'll be doing homework as well. And that's the sort of thing that you'll be asked to do on an exam.